Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Belated Happy New Year to everybody. We've been on hiatus for about a month. Happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Oh, thanks for having me back.
How was your break from the podcast?
From the podcast? Well, miserable, because I love the podcast.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But just in general, the break was very nice, very relaxing. Kids are back at school today, which is, it's time, as any parent knows.
Yeah.
It was lovely, and I'm glad it's over.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's really the overarching, one of the overarching holiday sentiments, I think. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot we could do today, having been gone for a while. As some of you may know, we soft launched a December poll about 4 days before Christmas?
We disappeared.
Yeah. Like maybe the second, like the last day of Hanukkah. Maybe
I think it was. Well, it was. I think it was the week. It was the week before Christmas. I think we did it. Right. Yeah, that's when we released it, which is a good way to bury your own work. So we thought, but not really.
Right. Well, and we can go behind the scenes on that at some point if we need to. But that December date is out there if you missed it. I mean, if you're on our email list, you would have gotten an email or a couple of emails about it, day of release. So two things. If you haven't seen that poll, you're not aware of it, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Follow the polling link on the front page. You'll see the latest poll link, the archive link if you want to dig down a little deeper. So have a look at that if you are so inclined. And also a post in the blog area of the site that kind of drills down into kind of a first cut at the release, and we'll be coming around to that. So we'll talk a little bit about that, without trying to talk about old news in a little bit. But, we've been gone, Josh. It's a new year. I thought I'd start by just saying, we ended the last few podcasts, as I recall, of last year, kind of mulling the end of a very long legislative year with all the special sessions and the Paxton impeachment, all the things that colored Texas politics last year, with sort of at the time, kind of a distant eye, if you will, or just, the very beginning of a pivot toward the 24 election season, which starts in Texas, of course, with the primary election season. I'm wondering just kind of what's on your mind, I mean, sometimes I think, we tend to get inherently a little bit myopic, particularly when we're trying to do the podcast on a week-to-week basis.
Right.
When we're trying to produce some content, not quite on a week-to-week basis, but, and we're doing one poll after another now that we're doing 6 polls. I think, one benefit of having a little bit of a holiday break is to get a little bit of breathing space and a little bit of contemplation. I'm just wondering what kind of your, when it comes to, politics, what's on your mind as we start a new year?
Yeah, I mean, I think like most people, I'm probably, focused on the thing that's right in front of my face, which is the primaries, to a large extent, more so the state level primaries than the presidential primary election, partially because the state level primaries are a little bit more interesting at the moment to me. But the other thing that I'm sort of thinking about, at a higher level, in the same area is just, this is the part of the year where it's like, I think we need to be careful. We talk a lot about, not over-interpreting data or, making sure that when you are looking at data, you're applying it to, the appropriate use case, let's say. And at the moment, it's sort of like, you need to sort of keep your data, the arguments that you draw from that data, and the focus of the competition you're talking about aligned. And what I mean by that is I see right now there's a lot of things flowing around in the atmosphere sort of talking about these primary elections. And sometimes there's sort of these basically like general election arguments, sort of these things that kind of make their way. And it's like, well, what are Republicans going to, I mean, this is a terrible example, but it kind of proves the point. It's like, well, what are Republicans in the primaries going to say about abortion? And the answer is nothing. or, hey, look, we banned it. I mean, that's not an issue in the Republican primaries, right? And so there's a little bit of this kind of, we're already kind of have one foot in the general election, especially with the presidential kind of campaign almost seeming maybe set in some ways. But we're still very, very much in this primary season right now where, we really are talking about competition amongst a small group of Republicans for a small group of Republican voters in the Republican primary. I don't really even have anything much to say about the Democratic primaries at this point outside of the Senate race. And so
that's pretty quiet at this point.
Pretty quiet at this point. But I think it's just sort of, it's interesting in that, there's this two-step process, right? We have to get through the primary season first and then move to the general. But I think a lot of times at this point, there's a lot of munging that goes on. It's like January's here. It's 2024. It's an election year. What's going to happen? And it's like, ooh, let's get through these primaries first, right? Because there's plenty right here in front of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think there's a real tension in that between knowing full well that, particularly in a state like Texas, the primaries are, very important.
Yeah.
For many, if not most offices.
Determinative is a strong word, but it's not.
They're determinative, right?
Yeah.
So, I get that. I also, we were talking about this beforehand a little bit. I mean, the sense of people that follow this and those of us that read about it all the time and are, the building or reading spreadsheets and looking at endorsements and campaign contributions and all this, in a struggle for a very small share of voters, in as we've been saying in here a lot recently, I think, in a very crowded environment. I think, I started the year, and this is probably just to some degree an accident of timing. The calendar flips, and just about the time you're kind of emerging from the holiday stupor, indifference, whatever you want to call it. We now have the January 6th anniversary as now a date in the political culture that I think we'll be marking for a long time.
Right.
And I think that really did get me thinking a lot more about, attitudes on January 6th and the larger, simply put, it got me thinking about the presidential election and probably, the stakes of the presidential election, how it's framing politics more, and just how important that election is going to be in this year. And I sit here and I kind of, want to sort of hunch over a little when I say that. I mean, but there is a strange dynamic out there in the discussion of this, in that just making that point is, implicitly political. And I think, it implicitly gets read as implicitly political or biased, because so you just want to talk about January 6th again. Look, I'd be happy to never talk about January 6th again if I thought we didn't need to.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm sort of laughing because it's funny. I mean, we're sitting here and it's like, on the one hand, I'm saying, I just want to look. I mean, so much just happened, right? We just had this whole year of legislating. We've got so much going on just within the Republican Party of Texas and so many cross currents just right there. And I'm like, hey, let's just focus on this. And you're totally right, because there's another side of this, which is like, yeah, but do you remember? I mean, like, and I can say this as a pollster, as someone who follows politics like you. It's like, do you remember what it was like when Trump was center stage?
Yeah.
Like, in terms of the environment, I'm just talking about the information environment. And it was overwhelming. I mean, it was like, being a pollster during Trump's first term was like drinking from a fire hose every day, because they're like, oh, do we need to ask about this? No? Yes? Maybe?
Yeah, right. No, I think
you're juggling this. And the truth is, as much as I might want to say, as much as I want, maybe this is just wishful thinking, as much as I just want to focus on the primaries right in front of me right now, there is an aspect to this that I think is reasonable to say. It's like, look, that may not be the focus. Yeah, right.
Well,
we kind of have to wait and we have to wait and see how this all plays out. But but there's going to be a big, a favorite term here. There's going to be, a big exogenous force here. It's not exogenous, actually. It's endogenous now.
Right.
Good words to look up. Which is Donald Trump and his impact on just everything going forward for the rest of this year. I mean,
and I think, we made it, we got a great example of that. And we talked about it probably in the last podcast we did last year. I mean, at a time of all the kind of, overinterpreted or not tumult within, that is going to be expressed in the Republican primary in the state. And after, the end of a very rocky legislative session for Republicans, Trump, former President Trump appeared in Texas, Governor Abbott endorsed him, and, that, illustrated that indigeneity that you're talking about, right? I think in a lot of ways. So, but I mean, and I think, the things, they are connected,
right? But
it also gets, very tricky in terms of, your well-taken caution about overinterpretation. But I mean, I think these are the things that are really front and center, right now.
Yeah. And part of it, just to be mechanical just for a second, is just, it is just thinking about, there are different messages for different groups of voters and subgroups within those groups of voters. So the Republican primary, that's sort of, messaging you're hearing from Abbott, from legislative candidates, from legislative challengers, is geared towards a very narrow slice of the Republican Party within a very narrow geography within the state in most cases, right? And at the same, that's all true. At the same time, Donald Trump's influence overrides all of that, right?
That terrain has really been influenced by him.
Yeah, and it's been heavily influenced by them. But then again, at the same time, I don't think, I think given the fact that Texas is trending a competitive direction is kind of the way that I've been putting it recently. It's trending competitive, which means it's not competitive, but it's trending towards competition. It does raise the question about, the impact that Trump has on the Republican Party, the impact that has on the primary, and whether or not that has any hangover or carry through to a general election environment that may be pretty different. You know, and so that still matters, but I do think at this point it is still useful to try to keep these things relatively distinct, at least for our own selves, and trying to understand the moves that people are making and what the consequences might be. Because if you just sort of think of it as, well, for example, well, are vouchers, a big issue? Are they going to be a big issue in the general election? It's like, well, I think, whoa, slow down.
And we've talked a lot about the relative, salience of these issues and how much voters are hearing about them, and I think we've gotten in the habit of checking in on that a little more regularly, which I think has been a good move for the poll. And I guess, to the degree to which this is now internalized, and I guess, what really made me think about it more was a very mechanical thing. I mean, we hit January 2nd and, the holidays were over and January 6th was coming. So we started putting together a post just collecting the public opinion data in our polling of Texans on views of January 6th and the intention of the rioters, views of Trump, views of the 2020 election. And, clearly I found it difficult to look at that data and not say, we really do need to pause and think about the implications, whether directly or indirectly manifest in the Republican primary and state legislative races. Yeah. That, a majority of Republicans don't think that, the riot was intended to overturn the election. A majority of Texas Republicans don't think the 2020 election was legitimate. And even, much larger majority of Republicans still have favorable attitudes toward Donald Trump. Right. And I think you can't look at those numbers, to me, and not pause a little bit, in reflection on, whether it's front and center in the primary or not, where the psyche of Texas Republicans are and Trump's presence there.
Yeah, but I think this also is what proves the point in some ways that I was trying to make, which is that, when you've got nearly, let's say, around 2/3 of Republican voters in Texas who think that the 2020 election was basically illegitimate, that Biden's victory was illegitimate, about 2/3 who think that essentially the protesters were not trying to overturn the election. I would assume, I think it's fair to guess, and I think it's probably that those percentages are higher among Republican primary voters in Texas. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it's closer to 80 or 90% among, again, Republican primary voters. Yeah. But that's actually the point, right? So to the extent that there's, Trump is in court today, making claims of broad-based claims of immunity that a lot of, Republican elected officials are going to back because right now they're in primary season. I mean, regardless of whether they agree with it or not or the politics of it, They are in a primary season right now where that view is overwhelming. It's not an area of contention among anybody. It doesn't matter whether you voted for Paxton's impeachment or not. It doesn't matter whether you support vouchers or not. Trump is your guy as far as the Republican primary electorate is concerned, as far as your public projection is concerned. Does that become a liability later? Potentially. Right. And when I say liability, I don't mean a liability like you're going to lose a bunch of voters here. I think if anything, actually, this is an important point.
Well, it's a little more indirect, probably. Right?
Well, it is more indirect because I'd actually say, the data showed actually that a lot of legislative incumbents in Texas overperformed Trump in the last election. So, I mean, this is not to say that they're going to be losing, but the issue here is that the electorate expands. The Republican electorate expands. Yeah. And some of that sort of full-throated endorsement of whatever and, however could become problematic later, but that's why we need to separate these things out a little bit. The moves that they're making right now are not indicative of.
And of course, there's a lot of
uncertainty.
There's just so much uncertainty in that. I mean, and going back and looking at the data for that post, I mean, I was, struck, and I shouldn't be, and we weren't that struck at it at the time, but Trump's job approval rating among Republicans before the last election was 90%.
Yep.
And so one might say, well, his favorability ratings, and we have a piece that's on the site, that's in the blog site that talks about this. On one hand, his favorability ratings are a little lower than that. They're in the 70s. But his favorability ratings, when I went back and checked, have always been, his personal favorability ratings have always been a little lower even among Republicans when we asked both than his job approval ratings. Obvious kind of reasons for that.
Yeah, and I would just say a quick one is, outside of office, he has less control over the narrative surrounding coverage of him.
Yeah. There's a lot of plausible reasons that don't necessarily have to do with
big changes in attitudes.
Yeah, big changes in in attitudes among Republicans. So with that, let's go back in the direction you started with all of that, and kind of look a little bit about I want to talk a little bit with the time we have left about some pieces that we're working on now, or some data that we're working on some pieces for. And we're not sure exactly how we're going to parse out a very large text file right now in posts, but it will probably be more than one. But, I want to sort of start by focusing or talk today on a couple of batteries of questions that we did that kind of, and we articulated it this when we rolled the poll out, that shows legislative incumbents in the Republican Party facing a primary electorate that on one hand, was clearly in significant numbers supportive of many of the, the policies and the agenda, the problems that the 88th legislature attempted to take on. But in some of them, potentially most important areas, was not so optimistic that what the legislature had done would actually successfully address the problems.
Right. So, just to give a couple examples of the former here, and we're going to focus, just to be clear, we're focused on the Republican primary here mostly, and we're focused on Republican voters for the reasons we've kind of already laid out. But, we look at some of the quote unquote divisive issues of the last session. 94% of Republicans supported, requiring athletic participation in colleges and, higher ed institutions to be based on biological sex. 91% supported, requiring armed security guards on public school campuses. 90% supported, increasing punishments for violations of election law. More than 80%, almost 90% supported, limiting discussion of gender or sexual identity by public school teachers and so on and so forth.
We should locate this in time, right? Because these results are from the end of the regular session.
Yeah, this is the end of the regular session. So if you think about, this is actually good to say, if you think back, all the way back, go back a year and think about, what were they really, what was the focus of a lot of the coverage and a lot of the contention during the regular legislative session? It was around a lot of these issues having to do, honestly, with gender identity, LGBTQ plus issues, children broadly.
Right.
Broadly construed, right? And the fact is those issues had overwhelming support among, Republican voters. Now, when we kind of...
And at the time, it did seem like that was the section of the agenda that led a lot of people to say, hey, look, this is a session seemingly fundamentally concerned with the upcoming Republican primary.
Right. I mean, and we'll kind of come back to this dichotomy here between the Republican primary and the general election, because I think it actually dovetails this really well. Now, when we jump ahead to the end of the year and we look at, we've gone through 4 special sessions now, and we looked sort of in the December poll, we asked about support for essentially the major proposals broadly around the special session call at the end of the 4th session. And, what we found again was generally pretty supportive, right? We found first and foremost, the main result from that was the most support by far were for the education policies that never passed. Now, not including vouchers, I should say, right?
The public education.
The public education. So increasing school funding, increasing teacher pay, right? Increasing, funding for school security. Those were extremely popular. They were extremely popular among Democrats. They're extremely, very popular ranged from very to extremely popular among Republicans. Also really popular, but only among Republicans, the COVID vaccine mandate prohibition. I guess those are the right order of words. Word salad there, right? Very popular. Obviously, anything having to do with border security, if you've listened to podcasts, incredibly popular among Republicans. These are two things that were not popular among Democrats. And, vouchers were sort of kind of, sort of floating somewhere in there a little bit. Republicans were supportive, majority. Democrats were, somewhat unsupportive, but that was about it. It was not as
71. In the item, which was kind of the, non-trade-off wording of the item. 71% of Republicans, only 25% of Democrats. Now you can say only 25, but as much as 25 supported establishing a voucher ESA program. Now compare that, to put a little more meat to get backtracking on what you said. When it comes to increasing teacher pay, 76% overall and 3/4 supported increasing teacher pay, and that was 91% of Democrats, no big surprise, 78% of independents, and that was 78% of that 78% was Republicans. So 3/4 of Republicans, I think overall it was about 80%. Right. And so, 3/4 of Republicans, 91% of Democrats. That's a pretty popular idea.
Pretty popular idea. Didn't happen. And so then we also asked at the end of the session about some of these sort of big issues that we'd asked about multiple times. We asked about basically confidence in these legislative efforts to address some of these big issues. So again, focusing on Republicans here, again, the lack of confidence was kind of, I don't know if I'd say surprising, but notable, right?
Yeah,
Because we had seen this lack of confidence earlier.
Right. We've used this general structure before. But
only 27% of Republicans said that they were either extremely or very confident that the legislature had increased the reliability of the electric grid. 26% were extremely or very confident that they had increased the reliability of the water supply. 35% said that they were confident about the legislature's attempts to improve school safety. And even despite all the money that's gone into, I would say border security is the most interesting one in some ways because there's so much public spending, public effort, communications on all that they were doing to address the border. Now, at the same time, this is where kind of the national-local dynamic gets a little tricky, right? Yeah. But only 32% said that they were extremely or very confident that legislative efforts are going to improve security along the Texas-Mexico border. And again, these are high watermarks because Republicans are the most confident. Independents are a little bit less confident. Democrats are significantly less confident. Right. And so, you kind of...
Let's sit on that for 1 second. Yeah. I just want to, because we can't help but dwell on border security. But sure. I think unpacking that is really interesting. I think, the key point you make, I think, is really important that, border security is the most inherently, at least, in some contexts, the most inherently national issue here.
Yeah.
And very, expectations are no doubt interspersed with expectations cultivated by Republican leadership and, to be fair, the facts on the ground and the media coverage of those facts on the ground.
And especially the partisan media coverage of those facts on the ground, right? So, on the one hand, I think, you can look at these in a couple, that result in particular in a couple different ways. I think one, you can look at it just with shock and say, we've gone from hundreds of millions to many billions of dollars that the state is spending on border security. Really the main banner success of the second set of special sessions was to, increase, to create a state penalty for being, an undocumented immigrant essentially in Texas, to increase funding for, more wall building, Colony Ridge.
Legally empowering state enforcement.
Legally empowering state enforcement. That's what I meant on the first one.
Yeah.
At the same time, so you could look at that and say, hey, shouldn't, they did a lot. They really did. I think, full stop. At the same time, if you're watching any sort of right-leaning media at all you see is the crisis at the border all the time.
Yeah.
The federal crisis at the border, Biden's border crisis, whatever you want to call it. And so, there's this little bit of a tension. I don't even think it's not a tension. It's an opportunity in a lot of ways. But there is sort of a tension here between saying, look at all that we did for the border on the one hand, but on the other hand, the fact that it's not presented as intractable, but it is almost
Well, I mean, I
seemingly
think,
intractable.
What I was thinking about as we were talking about this and as we were writing this piece, it also becomes another exhibit in one of the things we're flogging in here all the time, which is, it's another example of why immigration and border security, whatever you think of the empirical piece of the problem, or, who's doing what or who's failed or who's whatever, why it's just such a good, in strict political terms, a good issue for Republicans, because they're able to demonstrate a lot of action.
Right.
And they actually benefit from from the skepticism that anything can solve this, that anything is going to solve this problem.
You can always respond to the demand because the demand's not going anywhere.
Right. And the base always wants more in a kind of perpetual sort of hungry cycle of, do more, do more, do more. That's not working. That's not working. It's not working because the federal government is failing. Do more, do more, do more. I mean, as recently as October, after all, as we've said in here before, after all the spending done on border security during the regular session and in the 3 or 4 previous sessions of drastic increases, we had yet more funding added during the special session. And then after that, we still have only 32% saying that they're extremely or very confident. And we still have
at least 60% of Republicans saying that we should be spending more.
Right. Exactly. And so I just kind of want to flesh that out a little bit, because I think, we talk about that a lot of times in terms of just the public opinion support at any given time.
Right.
Or the patterns of public opinion that show, strong Republican support and non-trivial amount of Democratic, a minority, but still a non-trivial minority of Democrats supporting these kinds of issues, the salience of it among Republicans. But there's also this anticipatory element, right? That, whatever you're doing, the problem still needs more.
Right. So just taking a step back then, it's really interesting, actually. I mean, thinking about the conversation we had at the top of this and then thinking about sort of the way this data was laid out, it really does actually illustrate what we were talking about in some ways, right? In the sense that when you look at the individual policies that were the most controversial during the regular session, and we've talked about this for, a few sessions now where, if there's an activated constituency within the Republican primary elected for something that has a unified desire, you better believe that it's probably going to at least get a hearing, if not some kind of legislation passed. And you can kind of point to abortion restrictions. You can point to the loosening of gun laws here in recent years, even I would say in response to, but in the wake of mass shootings. Some of this stuff having to do with gender and sex, and people might even say sometimes solutions in search of problems, but these are very popular policies, so that when you go to the Republican primary electorate and someone says, what did you do for us gun owners? What did you do for the homeschoolers? What did you do for the most, committed evangelical Christians who show up in every primary, right? We can say, we did this, HB fill in the blank, SB fill in the blank, so on and so forth. Now, because the session went on for so long, though, you get to this endpoint and you say, okay, you kind of got to this last piece. And again, they can still point to immigration and the border. And that's sort of, I think we talked about this a lot, but that is like a good catch-all backstop no matter what. You can say, do you know how much money I voted to spend on the border? Do you know how much power we've given to this governor to go after undocumented immigrants? So that's sitting there too. At the same time, that all speaks to the primary election perfectly. At the same time, and we talk about, Texas trending competitive, there are these other things, right? We ask about what, people's view of the direction of the state of Texas. And, for many polls in a row now, we've seen at least 50%, sometimes more, saying the state's on the wrong track. And that's not all Democrats, right? Obviously, it's overwhelmingly Democrats, but there's a good share of independents, a good share of Republicans who feel the same way.
Right. Yeah. The other way, the overwhelming share of Democrats say that.
Yeah. But it's not being driven entirely by Democrats. More interestingly, when we look at views of the economy, and we're looking kind of at the end of the year and over the course of the year, it's not surprising to find polarized view of the national economy based on one's party and the partisanship of the White House. So Democrats tend to view the national economy much better under Biden than they did under Trump. And that happened immediately when the office switched. And we can show you that in the data. So that's not to be taken too seriously. I mean, you have to sort of take it with a grain of salt. But usually that doesn't apply to the state economy as much. And when we look at views of people's views of the state economy and also their own personal economic situation, Republicans look a lot more negative in their views of what's going on than do Democrats. Now, this could be the same dynamic we're talking about the border could be going on here too, right? Where a national sort of, right-leaning press, and when I say, I mean, the the share of the national press that leans right, whatever you want to call it, or that constellation of networks and websites and everything, talk radio, everything else, is saying that Biden's economy is the worst thing ever. And so that is partially going on here. But also, if you're, a Texas statewide elected official or even a House member who wants to say, hey, we're good stewards of government, like you certainly don't want the Democrats in here. We're the pro-business, party. We're here, to make sure the economy is running smoothly. It seems problematic that so many Republicans, or let's say the Republicans hold more negative views of the Texas economy than Democrats. They hold more negative views of their own personal economic situation than do Democrats. And then you get to this other piece that we finished on, which is after an entire year of legislating, when you say, are you confident that they made schools safer? And the majority answer is no.
Yeah.
Are you confident that the grid is more reliable? No. Are you confident that the water supply is reliable? No. And even on this border thing, and again, this probably speaks more to the broader sense of just degrading views of institutions generally and all sort of sources of,
well,
everything.
That's the question, though, isn't it?
It is, but this is how these two things are going on at the same time. There's a sort of okay, the Republican primary electorate. I mean, we talked about this. I think at the end of the year, our last thing is, if you're an incumbent legislator right now, you do have a lot to campaign on.
Right.
You have a lot you can campaign on for that electorate. Move it, and to the extent that you are let's say a challenger, you basically have a couple possibilities. You can say this person voted, to impeach Ken Paxton. You can say this person didn't support vouchers, which again, we'll see what the effect of those two things are, if any. And you could point to this sort of institutional, hey, look, do you really think the state's being run as effectively as it could be? And there is something there that you might be able to grab, onto. Is it enough to topple an incumbent? It's going to be hard.
Yeah. I mean, look, I agree with a lot of that. And I think that, in working and kind of reviewing the December data and kind of thinking about the kind of, 2024 launch as we've been going through the December data and looking at the sort of arc of the 2023 data overall.
Yeah.
There is something to be kind of more, articulated a little more clearly here, maybe in something we write about, where the nationalization of politics, where and how the nationalization of politics, somehow, in Texas and given the particular configuration of the political system here and the partisan universe, winds up, on one hand, producing these kinds of numbers you're talking about that look bad for Republicans, or if not bad, but at least, might lead one to say, well, maybe there's an opportunity. And look, lest we forget, this was kind of what Beto O'Rourke tried in 2022. Now, I don't want to open the new can of worms of, what Beto did right or didn't do right or whatever. But that was clearly, stewardship was the argument.
Certainly in the lieutenant governor's race.
Right. And so, I think that point, and I think you're right in that the similarity between border security and the economy in here and the way that the national, gets filtered through state politics. But in working on this, one of the things I did go back and look at, and, this is something we probably just need to think about a little bit more, but, like Greg Abbott's not taking the heat for those economic numbers in the way that Joe Biden is taking the heat for the economic numbers. And so there is kind of a, I think it's, we'll have to just think about different, we haven't talked about it that much. I'll think about ways about, looking for this in the data, but in which these negative attitudes exist.
Yeah.
But, the distribution of partisan control nationally versus state serves to insulate state-level leaders a little bit.
Well, and you made a really good point in some piece we wrote, and it was an aside. And when I say that, it's the one, I wouldn't say anyone would notice it per se. I noticed it because we're writing together, and I may not even have made the final piece, and I don't remember where it was.
Yeah.
But you sort of offhandedly at some point pointed out, when speaking of sort of, Abbott and Patrick's sort of involvement and prodding and pushing, and especially in the fourth special session, reminding our readers that they won't be on the ballot in 2024.
Yeah.
And there is something as we're talking about this that makes me sort of think about the fact, what impact does it have on someone like Abbott? So on Abbott's willingness to involve himself in these primaries, the fact that he's not on the ballot. Now, part of that is just even a resource. There's a resource answer that's like, well, yeah, of course, because he's not, he's not spending that money on his own reelection, so he can spend,
Right.
But there's also part of it that, would you really pick a fight, with multiple members of your own party while you're also kind of fighting for your own reelection campaign? Like, is that really? And so in some ways, he has the space.
Yeah.
To operate, there. And the fact that he's not on the ballot means that, it is less of a consideration really about his stewardship, because really we aren't talking about that. We are talking about.
And then the direct thing I meant there is that, we ask people, how do you, assess how Abbott's handling the economy? Yeah. And, his numbers have been fairly predictable.
Yeah, they've fallen along kind of the similar partisan lines as other issues. And that's
exactly.
I think that's kind of what happens if there's nothing specific.
Right. I think that's right. And same with border security. Right. I mean, and so, these issues lend themselves to a nationalization. They are nationalized in a way, but they are manageable given the leverage that Republican incumbents in the state have to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You were saying, in some ways that, O'Rourke had pursued this route, in the last election cycle, and it's interesting because, one of the things I'm thinking, this is just, you're saying we haven't really talked exactly about this, and there's something that kind of strikes me about this, and I'll put this observation out there, and you can decide whether it's true or not. I think there's some political science that might back this up somewhere. I've talked about this before, probably in this podcast, but, as the state becomes more competitive, it's not necessarily the case that the majority party starts to try to appeal to different voters.
Yeah, right.
So, I just think it's important to point this out. You might say, well, the state's getting more competitive, but if anything, it seems like Republicans are actually doubling down in a lot of ways on what got them here in the first, doubling down on their primary electorate, doubling down on these sort of Republican, really, especially, extreme conservative Republican priorities, and sometimes even at the expense of really broadly popular policies. So, and the obvious example here is, if no vouchers, no increase in teacher pay, no increase in school funding.
Right.
Again, overwhelmingly popular. And you think, I
don't think that was a purposeful strategy, but
no, but this is, but I think, again, looking from the outside, it would be really easy to say, hey, look, if the state's becoming more competitive and you've got these, kind of slam dunk policies out there, why isn't the majority?
Expect some Downsian movement.
Yeah, why wouldn't the majority party just go and do this? And the answer is that we don't actually see that happen very often. What we actually see is the opposite, which is you see this doubling down on your electorate, the people who brought you there.
I guess what I would say about that is that I'm not sure. I'm thinking about this in real time.
Yeah, now.
I'm not sure that when somebody doubles down, not to be too gambly about this or too subjective about this, that's a strategic decision in the metaphor, the figure of speech.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about this, and that, and this really came to the fore in the discussion of abortion policy, 2022 and early 2023. And then, for the reasons that we're talking about, I think we didn't hear a lot about it in 2023 from Republicans. And that is, I think Republicans are in and we've injected this into a couple of pieces, and it really needs to be the focus at some point. I think that, what we've seen is, this doubling down, quote unquote, has been injected into politics, but it's not entirely purposive. Now, I'm not letting Republican legislators off the hook, or not saying that people are keeping an eye on the primary. But I think that, some of these legislators, and, very few people will talk about this on the record while they're in office, but they are, they feel jammed up.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's part of the interest, that is one of the most interesting characteristics of the moment in Texas politics, I think does tie a lot of this together.
Yeah,
right?
No, I agree with that.
Which is that, the Republicans are leaving themselves open to the fact that they are servicing their primary electorate at the expense of, depending on the setting, if you want to be analytical, the currents of broader public opinion overall. The good of all Texans is more of a primary kind of argument, or in some cases, like abortion, even the carrying capacity of public opinion among Republicans themselves.
Well, I think you've actually answered the question. I think, I proposed this possibility that as it becomes more competitive, instead of seeing and opening up to more voters, if anything, you see, and I shouldn't have said doubling down because I knew, you're a poker player and, and and I'm a math guy and I was like, no, that was a mistake. I shouldn't have put that in your mind. But you do see this, whether propulsive, whether thoughtful or not, this reinforcement of sort of certain existing positions. But what you don't see, and this is what you're not seeing, is any attempt to expand the electoral coalition, even in a moment in which I think there's a lot of, I wouldn't say fluidity, but there's a lot of uncertainty about, we call it the party system in the state, right? And in the nation in a lot of ways, right? And here's the thing, is that the one thing we do know is that if things were to just stay ossified as they are, the Republican Party would get smaller and smaller and smaller because they're relying on older voters who are, basically exiting the electorate, by which I mean dying. And you have a huge, huge young population in Texas that looks very, very different. Now, again, do they think differently? Depends. So we're not going to say that we're not going to go around the demographics as destiny track because that's obviously kind of stupid. Right. But to the extent that, the Republican Party, just Republican leadership were to just try to take a clear-eyed look at the situation and say, boy, we've got these policies that would really give us a toehold, with many, many more groups of voters. But, politics doesn't really easily accommodate that. And that's kind of and that's why I think going back to kind of where I started saying, I really want to focus on the primary right now, because when you start making these general election arguments about, what about, it's not really applicable at this point, because if that member can't get through the Republican primary, none of it matters.
Well, yeah, right. That's exactly right. And in that sense, look, everybody's, you don't get to make the conditions of your own action in most cases, right? In some ways, I would say, in all cases.
Just physics experiments.
Not to use a word that, not to use a word that's become problematic, but, context matters a lot. And you don't get, you do your, look, successful, strategy, successful political strategy I think is generally mindful of context, and when, and recognizes the ability to help shape the context you're going to act in.
Yeah, but I think,
and I think a lot of Republicans have, Republicans in Texas right now, there are all these elements of the context that are really favorable to them, obviously, but there have been some unintended consequences that are largely structural that have to do with, in large part, being the only game in town a lot of time. And you get, word being used a lot in here. But you get myopic, right? Now, but I think to your broader point, and
Can I say one thing about the myopic piece? I just want to say also, I also think it's important to point out that, if you expect any elected official or want to be elected official to look at context beyond that cycle, you're going to be disappointed. And that's something that comes up again and again and again. So that feeds that myopic view, because the reality is what we're talking about here is we're talking about long-term trends. We're talking about, what happens as these people enter the electorate over multiple election cycles and these people come in, and yet the still focuses on a smaller and smaller share of the electorate. It's that's going to have downstream consequences, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that anybody, even Greg Abbott, with all the money in the world and all the time really to kind of focus on this, is thinking about the Republican Party of 8 years from now.
Yeah.
That is not his job.
No.
That is no elected official's job. That's not what they're doing.
Yeah. I think, the time horizon, broadly speaking, given the way that, we have, election years and legislative years,
Fingers crossed.
is a couple of years.
Yeah.
Maybe 4. And that doesn't mean that, I don't want to oversimplify. People, especially I think effective people, have the ability to strategize a little bit further into the future. But, as an input, it has a lot less weight than, as you put, you put it, succinctly 5 minutes ago, you got to survive the primary before you survive the general.
Well, and I totally agree with you, because I think that the longer term things, for good, effective people, that happens in the legislature. Those are those people who are they're working on these issues session after session. I'm not saying that 100%.
But even in terms of
electoral
strategy, I think there's some, but I think it's less so. I think you're right. It's, it's much more immediate. That's what elections are sort of designed to do. So, with that, I want to close out pretty soon, but I think we also just said, and so, I think one of the upshots here and one of the questions, and we were talking about this a little bit before the podcast pursuant to some of this writing we're doing is, it's also good to remember as we're saying a lot, I think, at the end of last year, and that was confirmed again in the December poll. Yeah. Not a lot of people are paying attention to the legislative stuff that we pay a lot of attention to. And I think it's a fair question to wonder, and it's something that we're wary of asking on polling because we know that you can't really get these kinds of attitudes out of people because they probably don't have them very clear in their mind when you ask them. But, how much of this are people thinking about when they're going down their ballot and they get to the box for their state representative? How active is the decision making? What are the inputs? And that's a pretty tough question, I think, in a lot of ways.
It's a very tough question. Because, I'll just
it should temper us. It should temper our conclusions and our analysis all the time, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's one of these things. One of the things that I sort of started kicking around in grad school and then, left as you do, these things is this notion of, like political knowledge.
Yeah.
Political knowledge is an interesting subject in of its own right. Sort of what people what are the facts that people have and bring to bear about politics. There could be all kinds of things. It could be, civic information. It could just be basic knowledge. It can also be, things about legislation process, right. Whatever. And, what we say is, the mean for this is pretty low. Most people don't know a lot, but the tail goes on forever. There's people, a lot of you listening to this, you're out on the tail because you are listening to this. You're already so engaged. And you have to think about voters in that way too. For a lot of voters, it's as much as, do I remember the incumbent's name? And that's part of why incumbents are so, so successful in some ways because they're there. They're, we'd say, if you do any sort of brand work or if you wear brands, it's like, look, one of the things that brands work so hard to do is just to be in the consideration set. Right. Just to be on your mind when you're making a decision.
And there's plenty of research about incumbent advantages and name recognition, as you say.
Right. And so there's that. But then there's this other piece, which is like, okay, yeah, but like, but you're like, but if you want to be skeptical to just kind of that real kind of flip notion, and the point I should make is there's a lot of variance among voters. So we can't say one thing applies to everybody. But then you say, well, why did they spend all this time doing all this stuff then? If none of it matters. And then that brings up this next issue. Well, yeah, but then they want to selectively highlight based on what they think, highlight different accomplishments that they think are going to put them in the best position in that district to be renominated to win an election again. I think the thing that's sort of sticking out in my mind right now, so first and foremost, with that in mind, as we've pointed out, there's a lot of things that the Republican incumbents can hang their hats on. Multiple things going on.
We made a big point of that, I think, in the last podcast or the second of the last one. Yeah.
I think what I'm kind of curious about is, to the extent that, I'm just gonna go say this, to the extent that Republican politics has become, less tethered to like even shared facts among Republicans, right?
Yeah.
I wonder what impact that has, on kind of these legislative dynamics. To the extent that, someone can, let's say assuming they can generate, enough resources to compete with an incumbent, legislator. Is there any penalty for saying something completely false?
Right.
Is there any penalty for saying, because you saw it a lot this year. How many, there's a good Texas Monthly article piece you put out. How many conservative Republicans are being described as basically Democrats right now? Or have been in the last year. Right. People who no one would consider to be anything but a very clearly conservative lawmaker being described as anything but.
Can you convince Briscoe Cain's voters that he's a rhino?
Exactly.
And will that be how they make their voting decision if you can convince them?
Well, and that's kind of the question, right? Yeah. But it does overlap with your question, which is, well, what are people even bringing to bear to this? And if they're not bringing much, which is actually what we think, maybe there is a little more room.
Well, that's the ironic thing about this all the time. If they're not bringing much, then is there any, what does that say about the latitude you have?
Yeah, it says you have a lot of latitude.
Something to that, to whatever it is they're bringing. And and where I kind of wanted to bring that to is, because we've also got, we've spent the last, half hour talking about issue positions and assessments of the legislature and expectations of the general environment, and then, you put in there all these cross currents that have got the political press in Texas and people like us, to be fair, I don't want to throw stones here, kind of looking at, and then you've got, Paxton out there running around, and you've got Governor Abbott having endorsed opponents as of today on Tuesday, I think 6, incumbent legislators, having probably contributed to the departure of a couple of others. I'm still a little skeptical about what the effects of that are going to be, aside from, an influx of resources in those races.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, that's like, well, duh. Yeah. And I get that. But I mean, I think the problem is that to my mind, there's a tendency in the coverage, like right now there's, a real trope is taking place. And I think we've referred to it, at least in quotation marks, of, Attorney General Paxton's vengeance tour.
Yeah.
And the fact that, this was Governor Abbott, is embarrassed or somehow needs to, recoup admiration, because, he invested heavily in vouchers and the legislature didn't get it done for whatever, for a whole set of reasons. There's a part of me that I just think, yeah, we know a lot about that. I am very skeptical. Now, more true of, again, your distinction between the primary and the general election, critical here.
Yeah.
These things are much more likely to be salient among Republican primary voters who are, as a group, older, more attentive, more conservative, and more intensely, they identify more intensely, more closely and strongly as Republicans, meaning that they probably pay, more attention to this stuff. And yet, when the primary day rolls around in a couple of months, a little less than 2 months from when we're recording today, some of that I think is going to matter indirectly as we talked about, campaign financing and things like this. But it's a little unclear to me what, how you really model the fact that, or even conceptualize that those factors are really going to be are really going to be decisive. I'm just a little skeptical.
Well, and again, not to preview, I mean, I don't know if it's still in one of the versions of what we're working on here to try to make this clearer in writing, but you referred to the cleavages in the Republican Party as kaleidoscopic, right? Yeah. Which is not only to say multiple, but as you turn it, they can shift and adjust, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really good way to put it. And one of the points that I think you were making in that section, which I think was really spot on, is, and I'm going to add to it a little bit here, which is to say, if we were having this conversation, whatever, 4 election cycles ago, 8 election cycles ago, the cleavage in the Republican Party was very clear, right? You'd kind of say, okay, we've got we've got basically the center right of the party seems to have, the much of the gravity. And then there's this dissident far right faction that, kind of causes problems in the House usually, but kind of goes along with things. And then they have backers who are supporting these sort of far right candidates who are basically being sold as more, more clearly conservative than whoever they're running against, right? But when you get to this kaleidoscopic nature, that's just more confusing now, right? Because sometimes Paxton's on this guy's side and Abbott's on the other guy's side. Sometimes you flip them. Then you've got Texans for Lawsuit Reform, and you've got Phelan spending money over here. You've got ART. You've got
right.
You've got the state party.
Did you vote for or against Paxton? Did you vote
the state
for or
party
against vouchers?
And right, and all that stuff. And it's kind of like, to the extent that there was an easy sort of decision rule that was, again, we're talking about for most voters who are even the more sophisticated are still looking for easy decision rules. That's all kind of being thrown up in the air here a little bit,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's thrown up in the air, by all these immediate. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so on the one time, because going back to this data, I mean, what's interesting is that, it sort of depends on how you think about the primary electorate. On the one hand, you think, if you think of it as a collection of issue publics, as we call them, people who are really motivated because abortion is their issue, guns are their issue, school choice is their issue, right? Ultimately, there are votes they can look to. There are things that happen. They can say it's either this or it's that. That's one way that we could look at that electorate. Another way we could look at that electorate is not to get all social science. I'm already like, oh my God, don't do it. But I mean, you could think of it as in an ideological space, and you're looking for the member who's closest to you, right? You're far right. This person's closer to me on this, dimensional, this one unidimensional axis. here I am, this is the person I should vote for. But even if that were the case, this kaleidoscopic cleavage thing really makes that hard to like, where are you? Where am I? Not where am I? I might know where I am, but where are these candidates now?
Yeah.
I'm hearing one thing from the governor. I'm hearing another thing from the attorney general. This incumbent who's been in this district, for multiple cycles, who I know is telling me something else.
Right.
What does that do? And I don't think we know. I mean, just, to be quite honest. I mean, my gut is to say that, incumbency is a pretty big advantage. And most people who've supported challengers, even very loudly and even with resources, have generally failed in Texas in recent cycles. I think that that's kind of my modal expectation. At the same time, a lot of the sort of underlying facets of what it means to be conservative and what the markers are or the litmus tests, which it depends on who you talk to or who you're listening to, just make this a lot harder, I think, to really game out.
And to the extent that it's interesting we end here because things that we talked about, long-term consequences of decisions, but that emerge from short-term strategic considerations and actions and the tactics that come out of that, is that the success of some of those fringe groups in conjunction. Again, to be consistent with, with changes in the national environment, have even further muddied what was 10 or 15 years ago, the Tea Party, busting in and, wanting a seat at the table. Well, I think broadly speaking, the Tea Party that has sort of morphed into, quote unquote, a kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of MAGA Republican ideological formation, if you will, have changed that terrain in some ways. And it does mean that, we saw a legislature that, as we said last time, can both effectively ban abortion in the state ahead of constitutional validation.
Right.
Pursue a lot of the kind of very far-right policies we've been talking about.
Remove licensing for gun requirements.
But still campaign and say, but, we also tried to do something about the grid. We also tried to do something about water. And critically, look, the border is clearly a mess, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, sons of, descendants of immigrants, or, you came over on the Mayflower or whatever. There's clearly a problem here. We've done something about that too.
Lowered your property taxes.
Right. And so, it will be interesting to see if these kind of kaleidoscopic cleavages, what they look like once the primary elections are behind us. Mm-hmm. And again, in all probability, Donald Trump is the presidential candidate at the top of the ticket. Yep. Ted Cruz is the Senate candidate at the top of the ticket. And then you've got all this other stuff going on in the general election. Now, that won't be settled before we get through the primaries, saying the primary terrain is very different. Mm-hmm. But I there's more action in the primary. That means more people are engaged, more people in the legislative interest group, media community are paying more attention and have more to do. There's more engagement, and it's cranking up attention to it, and it's cranking up, the drama or melodrama associated with all this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also going to crank. And the thing is, the worst part is it's going to crank up, overinterpretation by interested parties of what everything means.
But I think, and I don't want to speak for you, but I think one of the things that, I'm kind of feeling is both edging towards here, and, making predictions is a Rube's game. But, if I had to bet, I wouldn't double down. But if I had to place a bet, I would bet more on continuity than change in what we see coming out of the Republican primary.
Yeah, we'd have to settle on how
what our criteria are.
Yeah, that's just to be fair, because I think someone could come back later and say, oh, well, they knocked off 3 incumbents, and I'll say, okay, that does that count or not? But
well, I would say
it's not enough. Would be
if you want to look at incumbent success rate, not much more than a standard deviation off of the last, not more than a standard deviation of what we saw over the last 20 years.
I'm even without looking specifically at those numbers, I'm comfortable with that.
I would even say plus, even anyway. So with that, well, fun to be back. Welcome back. Good to see our friends in the studio again, too. Thank you. Thank you for listening. As always, more formally, thanks to the staff in our production team here in the audio studio in Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Services and the Liberal Arts Dev Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks again to Josh for being here. Thank you for listening. And again, we'll post a version of this podcast with supplemental material at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back again next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.